kids are alright.
That was The Who, of course, with The Kids Are All Right, and The Who are the subject of a new book called The Who FAQ by author Mike Segretto, who joins us today on the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop. And Mike, for the audience, if you could give us just an idea of the character of the FAQ series of books.
They're almost like reference books, but not a sort of dry-toned reference book. What I think is the most interesting thing about the FAQ series is it kind of looks at the band's impact beyond just being a band and kind of looks at them in the larger culture.
Right.
And that was a really neat thing about The Who is that you kind of, I feel like artists like the Beatles and Elvis, you know, their impact on the larger culture has really been examined. But a band like The Who, we don't really think about it, but they really have impacted the culture in a way that goes beyond their music. I mean, they've really had a major impact, for example, on style and on fashion. You know, we kind of take people wearing the Union Jack for granted.
Right.
But that really started with The Who. So it gets into things like that, but it's basically structured like a reference book. You know, you can kind of flip around. You don't need to read it from cover to cover.
Mike, were you always a big fan of The Who?
Yeah, I got into them, you know, I'd heard them as early as 1982 when I was 8 years old, because that's when MTV came to New York. But as I grew up, I realized that wasn't really, you know, peak era Who. It wasn't, you know, the Keith Moon era. And when I really discovered them and they really kind of knocked me over the head is when I saw The Kids Are All Right. Seeing the band playing is, you know, during the Keith Moon era is what really blew my mind.
Right.
And mainly it was John Entwistle, because I had just started studying the bass around that time. I'd been playing it for a few years. And I just didn't know that you could play bass like that. To me, it was like, as I say in the book, it was as if the drummer had picked up his floor tom and started blowing through it like it was a trombone. You know, he was doing things with the bass guitar that you're not supposed to do with the bass guitar. He was playing as a lead instrument.
Right.
He was using all the fingers on his right hand and playing really, really fast, and just looked so bored while he was doing it, like it was just no big deal. and that kind of blew my mind also. Watching them play in that movie, it really clued me in that this is not a normal band. The Who is sort of like, you know, a bunch of guys playing together, but all kind of doing their own thing at the same time, which is really a very jazz thing, much more than a rock and roll thing, where, you know, you hear a band like the Stones, and the Stones are all like on the same groove.
Right.
You know, and it's almost to the point where, like, you can almost not even differentiate the instruments. I mean, obviously you can, you know, say that's a guitar and that's a drum, but they're really playing as this kind of driving unit where everything is kind of all sort of fitting together in its way. And with The Who, it's all these different things. They're all very complementary. It's like Dixieland, you know, all these complementary things happening, but they're all their own melodies and they're almost their own rhythms. And, you know, it's sort of that clashing personality kind of thing that they had as people, I think really translated into the way they interacted as musicians, too.
We're talking to Mike Segretto, author of The Who FAQ, and what I've done is I've asked Mike to come up with 3 Who songs that he wants to play during this interview, and this seems like as good a time as any to play the first one. So what's your first Who pick of the day, Mike?
Well, the song that I'm going to start with is, you know, I want to ease your listeners in with a more familiar track before it gets weird, and it's going to get weird. And this is actually a song that kind of a little bit goes against what I was just saying, and is more of a kind of unified sound, and it's Substitute.
Okay.
It's one of my favorite early Who singles, and it's Pete Townshend's first production for the band, and it's kind of an amazing first go for him as a producer, because it's an amazing sounding record. I mean, basically you just have, you know, you have some guitar, you have some bass, drums, and a tambourine, and it sounds like, you know, the wall of sound. It sounds like the Wrecking Crew, like Bill Spector's group. He just got this huge sound out of this very kind of simple arrangement. Great sounding record. Elvis Costello called it a perfect song. I think that's as good of an endorsement as you're going to get.
You know, Mike, I've always had a fascination with how certain bands, especially bands from Great Britain, were marketed and packaged in the United States. And that extends to compilation albums that the band themselves had nothing to do with. Mm-hmm. And that was one of my favorite chapters in the book, you know, talking about, you know, the Magic Bus album.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. And it seems that much like the Beatles and a lot of, and the Stones too, you know, a lot of these British acts really had no say over how their music was marketed in America.
Oh, yeah, and that was definitely true of The Who. They were not treated well, and as far as labels go, you know, in America, The Who were on Decca, and Decca was not a label that was really used to rock and roll. You know, it was very different from its British equivalent. And so, you know, Decca threw together this very weird compilation in 1968, in the year that The Who didn't really have a proper new album to put out. And it had tracks that had already been released on other records, and, you know, it was packaged as if it was supposed to be a live album, and it wasn't a live album, and, you know, to cash in on the impact that The Who had made at Monterey Pop Festival, where a lot of Americans really got their first taste of The Who and saw what a spectacular live band that they were. But yeah, you know, 1968 is kind of like the last year, really, that that American labels were kind of pulling that kind of stuff. It's even kind of late. I mean, for most artists, they kind of ended around, you know, they stopped doing that kind of stuff around the time that Sgt. Pepper's came out.
Right.
Because that's when, you know, obviously everybody started taking the LP as a piece of art very seriously.
I'll ask you for your second favorite Who cut in this discussion about The Who, and are we going to start to get weird here?
We're going to start to get a little weirder with my personal favorite Who cut, and it's from my personal favorite Who album, which is The Who Sell Out, which is a pretty weird album. It's the parody of pirate radio with commercials between the songs. Yeah. And that iconic album cover where Roger Daltrey is sitting in a basin of baked beans. But this is a very different kind of song for The Who than Substitute. It's, you know, The Who is very known for their bombast and their power, but this is a very ethereal song called Tattoo. It has kind of a Pet Sounds feel to it and really showcases how beautiful Who's vocal harmonies were. And it's also one of Pete Townshend's first great story songs. It's a coming-of-age song. And I think that this song, you know, you can kind of feel like how he was building up to Tommy with the song, because, you know, it tells a story of a young man coming of age and really tells a complete story within 3 minutes. And it's a beautiful song. It's kind of a bittersweet and kind of funny song. Love it. Tattoo.
We're talking to Mike Segretto, author of The Who FAQ, today on the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop. And Mike, I watched the documentary film about The Who called Amazing Journey some years ago, and one thing that sort of struck me about the dynamic of the group, it was Pete Townshend saying that he thought he was a genius, John Entwistle was a genius, Keith Moon a genius, and Roger just a singer. I thought to myself, whoa, that's candid. I wonder how Roger feels about that. But he did later say that Roger came into his own around the time of Tommy, and now there was balance within the group. But it always seemed like Roger was sort of the odd man out.
Oh, well, you know, part of that was his fault, because he was very belligerent in the early years and would settle an argument with his fists. And, you know, Keith Moon was a little guy. Pete was a skinny guy. I mean, these guys aren't really, you know, they're aggressive guys, but they're not really fighters.
Right.
And Roger Daltrey took advantage of that, and he got himself in hot water and was almost kicked out of the band. And after that point, he kind of calmed his ways. But, he was, again, we're talking about four very, very different personalities, and Roger seemed to clash with the rest of the band more than anybody else did. But I personally think that Roger gets kind of a bad rap. As far as being, his artistic contribution to The Who, I think is kind of undervalued. And it's often said that Roger didn't really come into his own as a singer until Tommy, and he had a role to play. But, if talking back on the song that we just heard on Tattoo, he gives this very sensitive performance, 2 years before Tommy came out. I think he was a really great rock and roll singer who really got into character whether or not he even liked the song.
Well, hopefully he liked your next song that you're going to, of your three.
Roger did not like the next song.
He did not? Oh, boy.
It's a great transition. This is where we get the weirdest.
Okay.
And this is a song that for a long time did not have a very good reputation among Who fans, and it was kind of viewed as one of the songs that really made Tommy necessary. It was a song where they were like, we're putting this out and it's desperate. We need to have focus in this band, and we need to have something that we're all really serious about, and then that resulted in Tommy. And it came out in 1968 when, aside from that Magic Bus compilation that we were talking about earlier,
right,
The Who only put out 2 singles. They didn't put out a proper album that year. One of the singles was Magic Bus, which went on to become a real fan favorite, even though it's kind of a silly song. The other single was a song called Dogs, which is about dog racing. Mm-hmm. And I love Dogs. I think it's a great song, and it's often regarded as just being ridiculous, and Roger thinks that the song is embarrassing. And I think it's a much better song than Magic Bus, first of all. There's a lot going on in it. Magic Bus is kind of like skating on one chord for 3 minutes.
Right.
This has a lot of little bits going on in it, and they all fit together really well. It has this great, kind of pub sing-along chorus, and these little comic interludes between Pete Townsend and John Entwistle kind of playing the roles of guys putting bets on greyhounds. A song that had once been kind of viewed as a sort of embarrassment is kind of finally getting some love from the Who fans, and hopefully we can turn on some other potential fans by playing it now.
Yeah, where's me wage packet? I'll put 20...
Mike, if anyone wants to either get in touch with you or get the book, where should they go?
Well, I have my personal blog. It's Psychobabble, and the address is psychobabble200.blogspot.com. I'm not selling it on my website, but there is a link to Amazon, to its Amazon page on my website, right on the front page, so can't miss it.
All right, and finally, I have to ask you about The Who today, because obviously the Who, what's left of The Who, are still a going concern.
Yeah.
And what is your opinion on the continuation? Well, I think they announced that this would be, we've heard this before, but this would sort of be a farewell this year.
Yeah, we've heard it's a farewell this year, but we've also heard that they're going to be recording. It's possible that this latest announcement that they're bringing it to an end is as, legit as all their other announcements that they're bringing it to an end.
Right.
It's kind of hard for me personally to think about them as the Who, considering that, these guys aren't like the Stones. It's not like they could lose a bass player or even a guitarist and still kind of identify themselves as the Stones. It doesn't really make that much of a difference in their sound.
Right.
The Who, to me, like every member of that band, has such a distinctive sound that it's hard for me to really think that this is the Who when, it's not Pete, Roger, John, and Keith. Nevertheless, I thought that Endless Wire was a good album. People still like to go see them perform, and as long as that's happening, I think it's cool that they're still at it. And I think it's great that people still want to see them.
Well, Mike, thanks so much for coming on the show and
Thank you, Ghosty.
chatting about the book, The Who FAQ, which is in stores now, but you can win a copy right now by giving us a call at 201